Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service, jbiztechvalley.com, and now columnist for the Jewish Press.
Right, I'm having a lot of fun doing all of that.
Yeah.
And with
Keeping
us,
you busy.
That's right. And one of the pundits down at the Capitol, where I spend a lot of time,
hang out,
is our guest today, E.J. McMahon. He's president of the Empire Center for Public Policy. Welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to see you here in our set.
Yes.
Tell us what the Empire Center is all about.
The Empire Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Strictly speaking, under the IRS code, it's a nonprofit educational and research organization. So if you think of think tanks you may have heard of nationally, whether it's the Brookings Institution or Heritage Foundation or organizations like that, we're a state level equivalent to those organizations in terms of what our role and mission is, which is to do research on public policy issues and to get people informed about, give them information about what's going on in government and help them understand what the issues are.
Now, you're president, so what gave you the idea to start this? Because you were a journalist.
Well, that was a long time ago.
I know.
Actually, I think we first met when I think we first knew each other then. And that's actually the last time I was a journalist was 30 plus years ago, 33 years ago almost. I morphed into substance, as they said. I ended up going to the Business Council and then ended up starting in communications and then ended up doing their policy research.
Yeah, but what does it mean going into Business Council?
The Business Council is a statewide business group.
But what did you do for them?
I was doing public relations for them.
Okay.
They're a lobbying group for business. Then they have a research arm called the Public Policy Institute. So in the late 80s, I became the research director of that. Then I went to the State Assembly, and you may remember we dealt then, the Republican minority in the State Assembly in the early 90s during Mario Cuomo's last term as governor. The leader of the Assembly Republican minority then was Rap Rapelier, a great man, still, I'm happy to say, in our area, in fact,
That's right.
Retired near here. And our members at that time included a fellow named George Pataki, who would be elected governor in 1994. A lot of what Pataki implemented during really his most successful period, which was his first 2 or 3 years in office, he basically implemented the agenda that we had been promoting and proposing in the Assembly. We would always amend the bills that the majority put forward and say, here's another way to do it. You cut this part of the budget and add to this part, cut this tax instead. And basically, Pataki basically did a lot of what we proposed, which he himself used to carry on the floor sometimes. So that got me into the world of public policy and ideas, and I won't bore you with the interregnum, but then around 2000, I became a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is one of the more nationally known think tanks.
That's Ross?
She had been there well before I was there. She did some work there briefly about 23 years ago. People here often still associate the Manhattan Institute with her because she was the most visible product here. But Manhattan Institute has done a lot of things.
I know.
And a lot of urban affairs especially, and they publish a journal called City Journal. I began working for them on New York City and state fiscal and economic issues in 2000. And then in 2005, I started a subsidiary or a project of the Manhattan Institute which we called the Empire Center, focused on state issues more purely. And then a few years ago, in 2013, it was spun off. We agreed to spin it off from the Manhattan Institute as a fully independent, nonprofit research organization.
Was that peaceful and?
Yes, I mean, it was very much it was basically like, it was analogous to any situation where a corporate subsidiary in a particular line of business gets successful enough to stand on its own. And so that was basically, and I'm still on the roster as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I do some work for them.
So it wasn't acrimonious type of thing?
No, and I'm still associated with them.
How many people you have working with you, or it's only by yourself?
Well, basically, beside me there are 4 people right now.
So who funds your Empire's?
We subsist on individual contributions from individuals, foundation grants, and some support from business.
Would you consider yourself more of a conservative think tank?
Well, I think we're generally considered more conservative. We sometimes shorthand for identifying ourselves as that we're New York's free market-oriented think tank.
But you're certainly not a liberal.
Well, we wouldn't be, generally we find ourselves on the other side of the fence, not 100% of the time on details, by the way,
Okay.
but from many of the groups allied with, say, public sector unions
Yeah.
or something. But again, I'm happy to say that you can't completely, that we're not completely predictable either.
Okay.
We like to find allies and common ground with anybody we work with, which I think is probably a good approach to life anyway. So yes, we're generally probably more on the more conservative side of
And
issues.
you write a newsletter, like who goes to you? Like assemblymen would like to know, I mean, they can't know about everything, of course. So therefore maybe saying, hey, what do you think about it? I respect you as a...
That's the effort we try to make. And the beauty of it, in the old days, if you were running a group like this, you had to do newsletters and had to mail out, have a big mailing list and spend a lot on postage. An organization like this funded at this level, which is relatively modest, would be impossible before the internet. And with the internet, you basically are reaching everybody in the ways they need to be reached. So we have a website. We've produced periodic reports on different subjects. Sometimes
You just started doing the torch.
That was actually, we've had a blog. I've been working on a blog under different names. It used to be called New York Fiscal Watch.
Yeah.
I started that blog 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago at the Manhattan Institute, and then we renamed it NY Torch, and that's been around for a while. I mean, that's been around for several years now. If you look in the archives of it, you'll find a lot of material. So that's the main platform for when we want to have spur-of-the-moment commentary. And there's the beauty of a blog is there's no limit on length. You can put in a lot of links. You can put in graphics. Often that is the dress rehearsal also for, say, a newspaper op-ed. I will sometimes take something, not always, but I write fairly regularly for different newspapers. Probably my most common landing spot, but not exclusively, is the New York Post op-ed page. I've written for probably a lot for, but for a year I was a weekly columnist for Newsday, and the weekly I found to be too much of a strain.
Oh, okay.
So we use commentary. We're on, by producing information that's useful and informative on the issues, then you come to the attention of the media. And the media need voices from different points of view to explain issues to the public. So you end up on TV and the radio.
This is a public blog, really anybody. It's not just exclusive for assembly people or...
No,
it's just open to the public.
We don't actually talk, our audience is the public, is that part of the public that wants to be informed about and wants to learn about
Is that your journalistic roots? Is that where
it
that comes from?
I think that having a background in journalism helps a lot because it's fundamentally about communications. So you don't have to have a background in communications to do it, but it certainly doesn't hurt.
No, but as a journalist, you want people to know what's going on.
Exactly.
So I think when you said that, that kind of paralleled and echoed to me that maybe that was your journalistic roots coming through.
Exactly, and I think that some of the natural curiosity you hone that helps you be a good reporter helps a lot in this job. In fact, a lot of the fundamental issues that I deal with in this job, I first got interested in or curious about many years ago, 40 years ago actually, was when I first became a full-time reporter on graduating from college. And I remember I covered school boards among other, and local government in northern Westchester and Putnam County for the Peekskill Star, which no longer exists.
George Pataki's home paper.
Actually, yes, but I never met Pataki till I went to work for the Assembly, oddly enough. That was when I learned they were ferocious teacher contract disputes at that time in several of the districts I covered, the Lakeland School District and the Mahopac School District. And talking to board members who were sort of dissenters on those issues in those districts, I learned about how teacher contracts are constructed, and I learned about what are called steps, which we could get into later, but I mean that was a key aspect I never knew that I remember trying to convey in my stories then, that this dispute over how big a pay increase teachers got, that the impacts of it were compounded because teachers generally have a pay schedule that is an annual automatic longevity increment for each and every year, usually up to 20 years, 15 to 20 years. Every year you get an automatic pay increase. And the pay increase you hear about in the newspaper, like Mahopac teachers rejected a 4% salary increase. That's a 4% lift in the step.
Right.
In addition to the step. So the step is like 3% and the 4 was like in addition to that. it was eye-opening, and I learned that there were a lot of details like that to the way government works that people don't understand.
Well, my mother worked in the New York City school system, so I knew about all of that.
You knew. You actually, in your household, you talk about the STEP, right? It was, or also thought of as the COLA at that time.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So you, before I brought up the torch, you were going to
Yeah.
go through several programs that you have.
Well, we've done a lot of work on, one thing we do that's very important is one way to help people understand how government works and how government spends and what it spends money on is transparency.
Mm-hmm.
In 2008, when we were still a project of the Manhattan Institute, we started a website called SeeThroughNY.
Which personally I love.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you like it.
But people who work for the state can't stand it.
Well,
And
the
what is
people
it
who work for
about?
the state are some of the heaviest users of
No,
SeeThroughNY.
but some of the people are saying, I'm not an elected official.
Right.
My salary should not be out there for everyone to see. And I'm like, oh, but I want to see it.
Well, first of all, it has the salaries of it. It's a searchable database. If you go online, SeeThroughNY.net, SEE-through.net, NY.net. It has the salaries updated annually of all state and local government employees in the entire state at every level and public authorities.
Mm-hmm.
It has the pensions of all retired public employees. It has all of the teacher contracts and all of the superintendent contracts, and coming soon increasingly police and fire union contracts, so you can see the labor agreements. It has what the legislature now releases, which is not enough, which is every 6 months they put out a report on the details of their own office expenditures. That's how people discovered things such as Sheldon Silver's payoff through the law firms to the women who had sued for sexual harassment. That money is buried in those reports. And among other things, we also have a useful web app tool called Benchmarking NY. So you can we use the controller's data and then we compress it and make it comparable. We make it on a per capita basis and per market value of a house so that you can easily compare. You can look at how much your town or city or school district or county spends on a per capita basis and in different categories. And you can line it up and compare it to other places, which is kind of a cool thing. You can look at the town of Bethlehem and compare it to the town of Colony, for instance, or compare them both to the town of East Greenbush. And that tool is on there to help people. And this it was never possible to do this before. And the age of the internet helps this, and then we put this together to do it.
The age of digital files.
The age of digital files.
Because otherwise you'd have to key it in.
Right.
And you get that.
You got multiple years, or you'd have to look at, remember old Z-fold printouts, you'd have to page through them and look, and then find another one and look at that. So this is great. And we have something we started several years ago, Explore the State Budget tool, it's called. And what you can do is you can go on there, and the whole state financial plan, which to his credit, by the way, the numbers that are all back this up, the voluminous numbers the Budget Division has, the governor has had all these things put on a website called Open Data New York, which is like this, it's basically a massive state data dump.
Yeah.
It's not user-friendly.
No, of course not.
But by dumping the data there, I think it was actually appropriate, though, because then it lets people like us, intermediaries like the Empire Center in particular, we then help you make sense out of it, because we can take that data and you can now search categories of spending and taxes. So we try to make it useful and informative, and we try to add things to it. One thing we added last year was all the files of the latest updates on what the legislature is spending on pork barrel projects, mainly capital projects now. And we repeatedly file Freedom of Information requests, also known as FOIL requests, to update those files and put more information on. So that website is a big part of what we do. And
kudos to you.
Thank you.
So the think tank, you're actually thinking about things that are being made practical. Whereas I always think of like the Brookings Institute, oh, these guys are just sitting around the desk and they're, a table and a conference table, and they're banding ideas back and forth. They leave and then they go to lunch and
come back and think more.
Yeah,
some of what we do is that, in the sense that somebody has to be thinking about. I would say, a little facetiously, that you sometimes get the sense, looking at what comes out of the Capitol, that nobody there is thinking about anything in particular. We do try to take a step back and create context. So we do reports, in-depth reports on some subjects, and we do shorter issue briefs, some of which are very data-driven, based on information that pops out into the public arena.
I think that's great. I mean, I'm a big user and fan of what you've done so far with that.
Great.
But
You got some issues for today.
yeah,
I mean,
well,
yes,
that's
we
an
wanted to
issue.
get them.
SeeThroughNY is an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really a big deal.
I guess that's why you say that they catch some of these legislators on,
Well,
on their payoffs. I mean,
Well,
that's
one
something
rationale
they-
for having, like I understand how some person who works in an obscure job for a government might say, why is my salary on?
yeah.
Well, here's the thing. First of all, this has always been public information since colonial times. I
Sure.
mean, basically, it wasn't always easy to put it on the internet, but everybody has a right to know how their tax money is spent, number one. Number two, by having the information out there, it actually is like a pre-audit, because somebody can say, wait a minute, I see that Charlie Smith is retired with a pension. I mean, how did that happen? Look at how much I know that guy. He's not disabled. There are different issues like that. You can look at.
And you can look at the guy at the desk next to you at the same
Well, and there are people who do
grade
that.
and say, wait a minute, what? I'm earning less than the guy on the other side of the barrier.
And that our website gets over 1 million visitors a
Really?
year. A distinct,
Wow,
unique
a
visit.
year?
A million unique visits a year.
A year.
See-through. I will tell you that a lot of them, not most of them, but a lot of them are from inside government, are people in government checking on information they can't find in any other way.
Okay.
So including salaries.
Right.
So yes, that is part of it. But again, remember, the whole point of all the information on there and of all we do is basically it's your money.
Right, and you should know how.
You should know how it's spent, and that actually makes people take more of an interest also than in other policy issues once they see that.
So let me ask you about the $15 minimum wage.
Right.
I think you're against it, maybe?
Well, I've been very critical of it.
Why?
Well, my main, and a little background, we have a $9 minimum wage in New York now. The federal minimum wage across the country is $7.25. New York is one of, I think, 14 states that have gone above it.
Okay.
So in the last 2 years, it's gone from $7.25 to $9. That's a 24% increase. Adjusting for inflation, $9 is the highest minimum wage in New York in 37 years.
Okay.
The governor resisted raising it further. Then he zigzagged back and forth a while. Then last year in his budget, 14 months ago, he proposed in his budget to have a statewide minimum wage of $11.50 or $10.50, or was it $12.50 and $11? I forget which. One higher in the city and lower elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the spring, he convened this obscure agency called the Wage Board through the Department of Labor, which is empowered, we were reminded, under law, to impose any wage it wants on a particular industry, which it proceeded to do. It proceeded to have hearings, which were sort of a show trial. I mean, it was already predetermined. And concluded in the fall, to no one's surprise, that the wage should be $15 for fast food workers employed by national chains, which of course effectively means, has a ripple effect on the whole food prep industry, because if you're paying somebody at McDonald's $15, well then everybody wants to make at least what they make.
Everybody will just go to McDonald's.
So then the governor immediately, before that recommendation was out, he then took the logical next step of leapfrogging himself and everybody else and saying, I want a law making this minimum wage for every job in the state and every industry $15 an hour. And he began pushing that last fall. He proposed the bill doing it as part of his budget. It's not a budget issue. There's no need for it to be part of the budget.
Right.
The budget can be passed without it because it doesn't involve directly the state budget. This would mean that it would take effect at $15 in New York City in 2 years, end of 2017, end of 2018.
Now, he did also say, you talk about the state budget, he did up the minimum wage for state workers would be $15.
But that he did that, he said he unilaterally was deciding that all state workers will make at least $15, which he did once he was able to ascertain that hardly any state workers don't make $15 an hour. It's still somewhat unclear whether he meant all seasonal workers, by the way. I'm still not sure.
Okay.
The impact fiscally on the state of doing that was minimal.
Minimal, okay. So, but it's a nice thing to...
Sounded great.
Sounding great. So just let me ask you, with the $15 minimum wage, it's over time. So let's say, I think it was by 2020 it becomes...
2021. July 1st, 2021, 5 years.
It becomes $15 an hour. Now, I didn't quite do the math, but I would think that by the time you get to 2021, $15 is going to be what everyone is going to need to make, no matter what. I mean,
adjusting for inflation, For projected inflation between that, it's still equivalent to almost $13 in today's money. If we have inflation of 2.5% a year, which may be high, may be low. I would say that the main thing is what's been argued on that time frame has been, well, it's outside of New York City where it would take effect in 2 years. Well, that's 5 years. That's quote unquote, I've heard this a million, I wish I had $1 for every time I heard this, that it's quote unquote time to adjust. The very question that's the nub of this is how will employers adjust to such a big increase in wages? And what you hear across the board from the overwhelming majority of employers, by no means limited to food service or retail or service in general.
It'll get passed along.
They will do one of 3 or 4 things. They will hire fewer people.
Right.
They will make more people part-time and give them less hours.
Which means you don't have to pay them health benefits.
Or that's a ripple effect. They will do what they need to do to be able to stay in business.
Mm-hmm.
Smaller businesses often have very narrow profit margins, especially in retail, very slender. And to stay in business, they'd have to take more radical steps. I was at a meeting today of manufacturers from around the state, mostly mid-size and small. The vast majority of manufacturing jobs in the state now are the nub of where they remain are with these smaller and mid-sized firms, many of them specialty firms. And they expected to have a ripple effect upwards on their lowest paid people who don't make 15. They may make 17 or 18, but they expect a ripple effect. And they expect it to make their suppliers non-competitive. These are manufacturers who are in what's called the traded sector. They compete with companies from all over the world and the country.
Like Mexico, you're saying?
I mean, they compete with Pennsylvania, Mexico, Norway, I mean, whatever it is.
Yeah, but Mexico, they're paying them 10 cents an hour.
Right, well in Pennsylvania, they're paying them $7.25. So, I mean, it's as close as that and as far away as the other. Yes, they're in global markets, and they figured out they can compete in global markets now, but they're concerned about is how this affects their competition in the future. And again, how it affects their suppliers. This is something that's not talked about. Many manufacturing firms that are community-based will make an effort to hire local suppliers. Right. Like a guy said, the people who make the pallets, they use wooden pallets are the fact of life in manufacturing. The pallets are made by a local firm. Well, that local firm has to start paying at least $15 an hour for the people making the pallets. They're probably not going to be able to sell, to sell pallets at a price that's competitive for the guy who needs pallets. That's just one example. There's a ripple effect this would have. It would be billions and billions of dollars. Would there be millions of people whose pay rose? Yes. Contrary to what the governor says, though, most of them would not be poor people. They would be people who are already living in households that are above the poverty rate, in many cases in the middle class. Many people who work in minimum wage jobs, after all, are young or part-time, or they live in a household where their spouse or some other relative makes a bigger wage, so the total income is not just the minimum wage income. It's have many, many complex effects. The main point about the minimum wage of $15 is it's completely unprecedented. There's never been a minimum wage that high. The highest, adjusting for inflation, the minimum wage in New York has ever been was about $11.30 an hour. And that was not a norm, it was a spike in 1970 in today's dollars. The average over the last 50 years is $8.36, adjusting for inflation. And 9, as I said, is higher than it's been in 37 years. There's a lot of economists, left of center economists, who study this issue closely, who've advocated a higher federal minimum of $10 or $11, as President Obama has proposed. But they have specifically written, some of the most prominent economists, again, on the left, who support a higher federal wage, they pointedly do not endorse and won't endorse a blanket 15, which is what, for instance, Bernie Sanders is calling for on a federal level. Because they think it's too high to be, it's uncharted territory, that it could destroy more jobs than it's worth, and it have unintended consequences, and it's fraught with risks not worth taking. I think they're right. And we're not hearing enough of that reasoned argument here. We have not had a reasonable discussion of this in New York State. The Senate, Republicans, by and large, as a group, with some individual exceptions, are standing back, not saying anything. But
what's the political device now? Because the governor can just say $15 an hour, but does it have to pass the Assembly and Senate?
He's proposing a bill that has to pass the Assembly and the Senate. And the Assembly, the Democratic-controlled Assembly, would pass it. And will pass it. Has passed it, in fact, as part of their one-house budget resolution. The Senate Republicans have taken no position on it and have members critical of it. Some people are surprised that they find it difficult to take a position on it and haven't come up with a compromise that's much lower. But right now they're saying nothing, and they certainly are trying to resist doing it as part of the budget.
Okay. Briefly explain, because this is, I said $15 minimum wage,
Yeah.
but it's a livable wage, isn't it?
Well,
they're talking about. I mean,
the antecedents of the minimum wage were, it was not intended to be a living. And by the way, defining the living wage is another issue.
Yeah,
if you're familiar with
but
Marx's thought, is basically the labor theory of value is that something is worth the labor that went into it, and the labor that went into it ought to be a living wage. And the big question for society to determine was what is a living wage,
right,
which was supposed to be some master expert out there. The purest result of that, in the most extreme example, were countries in which everybody was poor and nobody had anything to buy. So that didn't work out. The more modern economic thought since the late 19th century is that something is worth what people will pay for it. And that the minimum wage, however, is something that's here to stay. And
right.
I think we found that a minimum wage that's not excessive, the minimum wage in the band it's been in since the 1930s.
But they're talking about this $15 interchangeably
with a
livable wage, and it's a minimum wage at the same time.
Right.
But by the time you get to $15 in 2021, it won't be a livable wage, it'll be a minimum wage.
Well,
and people will still say, we need a livable wage.
We need more, right. Well, some of these groups would claim that you need like $40,000 or $50,000 a year to live on now, and $15 an hour is $31,000 a year if you work 40 hours a week. I'll tell you, it's not going to be any easier to live on $15 an hour once the other things you buy and the services you need are influenced by the price. So, for instance, childcare. There are 12,000 childcare workers in upstate New York working for licensed childcare. Okay. Now, that doesn't include all the nannies, the informal, all the other people, okay? That's just the licensed daycare workers. But a lot of people have their children in these settings. There's 12,000 of them, and they make, right now, according to official government statistics, they make a median wage, the middle of the wage range for people in those jobs is between $9 and $10 an hour throughout upstate New York. Now, what do you think is going to happen to the cost of childcare when a occupation that has a median wage between 9 and 10 now rises to a minimum of 15? You can't automate away, you can't create a child care kiosk, you can't automate away a child care worker. You have to have child care workers in the same numbers caring for the same number of children.
There's a minimum number of children per teacher.
As there should be. So you know that child care costs are going to rise. So part of so in the name of helping you live, making life more livable for you, your wage is going to be raised and your child care costs are going up. The other thing that doesn't come up is that there are good wage supplement programs that we've supported very strongly that go back to Mario Cuomo and have been supported by Republicans and Democrats at the national level that boost your income if you're working.
We have just a couple of minutes. Let me ask you about, we're talking about wages, whether legislators should have a pay raise. In your opinion.
Not unless they change the system that they operate under.
But do you think $80,000 a year is a livable wage at this point?
You go from $15 an hour to $80,000. It's livable.
Depending on who you look at, when and on what basis, $80,000 they may be overpaid. They're among the highest paid state legislators in the country. I tend to hold to the view, although it seems unlikely to happen, that they should be paid less and that the sessions should be limited so that, and that even possibly, this may shock you, there should be more of them, so their districts are smaller.
Right.
In the assembly.
New Hampshire has 400.
Well, they have like hundreds
of 400
legislators who make practically nothing. I mean, I wouldn't go to that extreme. The state, I think under the Constitution, the state assembly could be 180 members. It's now 150.
Okay.
If in the ideal world, I'd have them pay something that was related to some fraction or multiple of the average private sector wage so that it would go up and down with how well the economy's going.
Okay, so just briefly, because we're running out of, we have seconds now. What is the level that you think would be fair, and you know, what's your bottom line analysis?
My bottom line analysis is they shouldn't get a raise unless they abandon the system of extra pay that gives almost all of them an extra stipend for leadership positions. I think that's the prerequisite for talking about any increase.
And
in
outside income?
I disagree with eliminating outside income. I don't think having a class of full-time politicians who do nothing else and know nothing else is a great idea.
Okay. So,
Out of time, it was so good, we're going to have to just ask you again to come back.
Okay.
There's always something happening in the state and the government, and you are a brain trust over here that there's a lot of brains, there's much to
Okay.
talk about. So continue your good work for the people of the state of New York, and do it with good health.
yes,
Thank you very
continued
much.
success.
Thank you.